started. Okay, welcome and good afternoon. My name is Hillary and I'm the Public Programs Coordinator at the New York Transit Museum. For accessibility purposes, I am a white woman with glasses and gray hair pulled back. Thank you all for joining us. This afternoon, we'll be hearing from Anna Zivarts, a disability advocate who argues that transportation planning should prioritize non-drivers. But first, if you haven't been, please join us at the Transit Museum. It's a unique space in downtown Brooklyn, located in a decommissioned subway station. We're open Thursday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. We also have a gallery and shop in Grand Central Terminal. For today's program, if you would like captions, please click on Captions and select Show Captions. If you don't see that option, click on the three dots at the bottom of your screen and you'll see a more expanded menu of options. We also have ASL support during the program. Our interpreters will be visible on screen for the entire program, but if you would like, you can also pin them to your personal screen by hovering your mouse over their image and selecting the little pin icon or the word that says pin. We also shared presentation slides in our reminder email, and that link I'll make available in the chat in just a couple seconds. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to add questions and comments in the chat throughout the program. I'll collect your comments and I'll share them with our presenter at the end of the presentation. So now I'd like to introduce Anna Zivarts. Anna Zivarts. Anna is a low vision parent, non-driver, and author of the book When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency, published by Island Press. This is now also on sale in the museum store, and I'll make that link available in the chat. Anna created the Week Without Driving Challenge, the hashtag Week Without Driving Challenge, and is passionate about bringing the voices of non-drivers to the planning and policymaking tables. Anna sits on the boards of the League of American Bicyclists, the Pacific Northwest Transportation Consortium, and the Washington State Transportation Innovation Council. She also serves as a member of Transportation Research Board's Committee on Public Health and Transportation and the National Aging and Disability Transportation Center Coordinating Committee. That's a lot. Now I'll hand it over to Anna. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you. Yeah, those are a mouthful. It's really lovely to be here today. Thank you, New York Transit Museum, for hosting me. Thanks for everyone for joining. It's lovely to get to present and share my experiences and share some of the work from my book. So to describe myself, I'm also a white woman. I'm in my 40s. I have red glasses on and short blonde hair, and I am based in Seattle, Washington. It's a bit of a gray day here today. And so my book is called When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. And this next slide, I'm going to do my best to describe the slides and the images on them and read any text for accessibility purposes. If this is new for you, I encourage you to experiment with it when you're doing presentations as well as a form of accessibility. And so this first slide is a picture of my book and also a picture of my kiddo and another kid, another neighbor kid on the bus here in Seattle. And oops, just making sure my mouse is in the right spot here. Oops, there we go. So I was born with an eye condition called nystagmus, and that makes my eyes wiggle all the time a little tiny bit. And so when I need to see things close on my computer screen, I'll get up really close to the computer screen. So you may see a nice view of my forehead at some point if I need to read something on the screen. It also means that, I don't see faces very well, especially across the street or in a crowded room. And I don't see well enough to drive. And so this was something that has shaped my life in many ways. I was born in Washington State, and this image on the upper right-hand side of the slide is the road where I grew up in Washington. It's got a lot of trees. It's a narrow 2-lane rural road, no sidewalks, definitely no transit nearby. And that was, frustrating as I got older and became a teenager and really did want to be able to go places. And instead of getting a driver's license like my friends, I had to rely on my parents to go places. And So I actually, as a teen, I heard about New York City, and I heard it was a place that the subway ran 24 hours a day. And I was so excited about that, that really without any other reason, I decided I was going to move to New York. And I did in 2005. And this image on the bottom right of the screen is New York City. It's a picture I took, and it just shows that the streets are crowded with people walking. There's people actually crossing against a light in this picture. And I loved being able to live in New York, and have the kind of mobility access that I could only dream of when I was a teenager growing up in Washington State. Um, I also talk a lot about micromobility, my ability to ride a bike. And I'm lucky in that my mom, as a kid, really encouraged me to learn how to ride a bike. And that's something that a lot of low vision kids aren't encouraged to do. And so this image on the left is me when I was like 6 or 7 with training wheels, learning to ride a bike. And I was so envious because this was at my friend's house, who lived in a neighborhood with sidewalks. And so she could ride her bike around her neighborhood, and I could not around my neighborhood that didn't have that kind of infrastructure. But biking has also been something that's given me a lot of mobility access, and I'm very thankful for that. So, and so how did I come to write this book? I was in New York City. I was doing communication work, a lot of video production work and storytelling work. And then I had a son, and my son was born with the same eye condition I have. And that was a bit of a shock for me. I had not known anyone else in my family. I hadn't realized it was genetic. And it made me, at first I had a really emotional reaction to that and really struggled with a lot of sadness and grief. And then I recognized that that sadness and grief was mostly because of my own struggles with accepting disability as part of my own identity, and my desire to sort of hide that and mask that as much as possible. And I was able to do that because I lived in New York City and I could ride the subway, and everyone else also rode the subway. And so I didn't have to tell friends that I couldn't meet them because I, didn't have a ride, and I didn't have to tell jobs that I didn't have a driver's license because it just wasn't important. But it also meant that I didn't really have to deal with my own internalized ableism and my own inability to really talk about my vision without breaking down in tears. And so I started seeing a social worker. I started connecting with other disability advocates online. At that point, Twitter was a really nice space to be for that. And it steered me back to actually working for the disability community. And so I took a job with Disability Rights Washington back in Washington State. And right away, I started to meet lots of other people who couldn't drive. And that sort of sense of isolation that I had felt growing up, where I assumed everyone who was an adult could drive, I started to realize that that wasn't the case, that there were many people in the state that I had grown up in that couldn't drive, and also many people that couldn't afford to drive. And so at Disability Rights Washington, I began to do a story map project where we collected stories from non-drivers from throughout our state. And we were really intentional to make sure that we had stories from every legislative district, because we wanted to make sure that when we went to elected leaders to ask for more investments in transit, more investments in sidewalks, that people couldn't say to us, oh, well, everyone drives in our district, because we could show them that there actually were people in their communities that couldn't drive. And so these images on the left is of the story map. It's called the Transportation Access for Everyone story map. And the image on the right is myself and Abby Griffith, who is an amazing organizer who now works down in Portland doing bus transit rider organizing, doing an outreach event where we are collecting stories for the story map. And so that story map inspired me really to write the book, and to begin to connect more with non-drivers. And I want to sort of help frame the conversation of who are non-drivers, because I think it's a new term to a lot of folks, and there's actually way more of us than I think many people realize. When I started doing this work with Disability Rights Washington and started doing the story map, I tried to find information about how many non-drivers were out there. And the sort of the easiest data I could find was that 31 out of every 100 residents in the US lack a driver's license, which that's a big percentage of people. Obviously, a driver's license isn't a perfect measure of drivers or non-drivers. There's people with driver's licenses who can't afford to drive or can't safely drive anymore. And then there's some people who drive without licenses too, right? But that gives you a sense of, the percentage of non-drivers in our country. There's also some states that have done additional research, which the state of Wisconsin has a non-driver advisory committee that's hosted by their state DOT, and that DOT did research, and they found that 31% of the population of Wisconsin are non-drivers. In Washington state, we pushed for similar research, and we found that 30% of the population in Washington state are non-drivers. This was a study conducted by Tool Design that got released in 2023. So similar percentages. It really is about a third of the population. And we are hoping that other states can do this research as well, and maybe someday we'll get some national statistics. This image on the right is a picture of me when I was doing travel for work. I went to Orlando and was trying to get from my hotel to somewhere to get food, and was walking down the side of a highway. And this is a place where, there were no sidewalks, but there were definitely those well-worn, paths in the grass where you could tell people had walked. And I think when you go to many communities, it may not be so visible how many people can't drive and can't afford to drive. But if you start to notice things like paths in the grass along shoulders of roads, you start to see that there's evidence, right, of this population that were everywhere. A central part of the story in the book that I tell centers around the disabled non-drivers, people who can't drive because of a disability, because it's not safe for them to drive. And I think there's an assumption that that many people with disabilities drive, because I think in our country we see one of the most visible symbols of disability is the disabled parking spot. And there's an image here of a disabled parking spot, that blue symbol with a wheelchair. But the reality is that people with disabilities are 4 times more likely not to drive. And we also use buses, subways, and commuter rail for a higher share of trips than people without disabilities. Also for people with disabilities, we are more likely to not be able to work. The transportation is a barrier for us. For working age people receiving disability payments, this is a survey from the Department of Labor, 51% of people who couldn't drive said transportation prevented them from working, compared to only 31% of people who could drive. So transportation access and not being able to drive are big issues for the disability community. Another sort of piece of this puzzle of transportation access is poverty, right? If you can't afford a car, or you can't afford a car with hand controls, or you can't afford a wheelchair accessible vehicle, and that's what you need, you may be able to drive, but you don't have that car access. And this is an image of Erica, who I talk to in my story, in my book, who is a wheelchair user who can drive, but she can't afford a wheelchair accessible vehicle. And so if she needs to go out of the vehicle anywhere, she needs to take transit, because the car that she has doesn't allow her to bring her wheelchair with her. So understanding that, it's complex, and it's not a strict binary between driving and non-driving, but that there are lots of, complexities and nuances to why people can't drive, and all kinds of disabilities that can prevent driving, right? Including being low vision or blind, having epilepsy, anxiety, PTSD, mobility disabilities, right? Traumatic brain injuries, mental health disabilities. So lots of things, both visible and invisible disabilities, that can make driving not a safe option. There are also many people who can't drive or can't safely drive who wouldn't necessarily identify as disabled. And folks who are aging out of driving, I think, often fall into this category. This is an image of my grandma, who continued to drive even though she had a heart condition that made her pass out. And so she would pass out and drive off the road. But she, definitely would never have thought of herself as disabled. And there are a lot of folks who age out of driving and age out of driving safely. 18% of people over the age of 65 don't drive, and 35% of women over the age of 75. That's a lot of people. And a population that, as our population ages, right, especially as boomers age out of driving, this population is going to increase. Another big segment of non-drivers are children. And yes, children count. I get so many questions about this, because about half of non-drivers are children. And people are like, oh, well, children shouldn't count. And I ask then, at what age should children count? Do we say 16? 16 is a really arbitrary number. That's when you can get your driver's license, but many children can travel independently before that. Do we say 18? Do we say 21? At what point does someone's mobility count? And the reality is that all of us need to go places, and we need to go places, whether or not there's someone in our household that can drive us. We recognize that when we, as a country and in many communities, have school busing programs, right, that allow children who don't have parents who can drive them to still get to school. We have it even in rural areas. There's an image here on the bottom right of a rural bus shelter for kids to wait for the bus. And then kids, if we design infrastructure that works for them, they can bike places safely. There's an image here on the lower left of a bike bus in Seattle. And then the top two images are of my kiddo holding his Metro card in Seattle. He loves riding the bus and waiting for the school bus with a friend. But yeah, I mean, in cities too that have really robust transit networks, cities like New York, I know that middle school students, right, ride the subway to go to school. And so kids can and do travel independently. And even if they can't, their mobility needs, should be valued. There are adults who can't travel independently and yet still, need to go places and still count as people who need to go places. So children, yes, are part of the non-driving population. And youth are as well. And increasingly youth are choosing or not able to get a driver's license. There's been a big decrease in the number of 16-year-olds that get driver's licenses, the percentage of 16-year-olds. In 2020, 25% of 16-year-olds had driver's licenses, compared to 43%, almost half in 1997 when I was a teen. It's a big decrease. And fewer young people, 20 to 25-year-olds, are getting driver's licenses as well. This is an image on the right of a bunch of youth, high school students waiting for the bus in Seattle. And, I think part of this, I get questions about, well, why are youth driving less? I think part of it might be that they have other options. Part of it might be that, social being online, like there's other options than going in person to places. And that, they prefer to ride transit. There's anxiety and driving is really stressful and also expensive. And that expense piece, I think, is a big piece of why we, many people in our communities can't afford to drive, can't afford insurance. Insurance rates are going up. Cars are becoming sort of more expensive. And households that make less than $25,000 a year are 9 times more likely not to have a car than households who earn $25,000 a year or more. Because of the racialized nature of poverty in our country, Black households are 3 times more likely to lack access to a car. And we saw this really during the pandemic, right? This image on the right is the bus in Seattle during the pandemic, when we saw the routes that served low-income communities, communities of color, communities with a lot of essential workers. These were the routes that retained ridership, right? Because those were the folks who couldn't afford to drive, that didn't have access to cars. And then we also see that new immigrant communities are less likely to drive and to have access to a car, more likely to ride transit, more likely to walk and roll places. And this image on the bottom right is an outreach event my colleague Abby and I were doing with folks who had recently immigrated from Afghanistan and Iraq. And, there's, I think, both cultural pieces too about just not being used to having to drive everywhere and adjusting to that change in the US. And also the cost of vehicle ownership make driving less of an option for many immigrant communities. Just going back to that cost piece, right? The survey in Washington State that I mentioned that looked at non-drivers asked people their reasons for not driving. And a big percentage of folks were, highlighted the cost of purchasing a vehicle, cost of operating a vehicle, 40%. 28% said the cost of vehicle registration was too expensive. And then we also have folks where the cost of, getting driver's ed, learning how to drive is a barrier as well. The cost of attaining a driver's license was a barrier. So overwhelmingly cost is a big reason that people can't drive and can't afford to drive. So how do people get around then? In cities like New York with great transit's a wonderful option. Walking and rolling places, human services transportation option for folks who live in rural areas and are disabled or elderly, getting rides from a medical provider or volunteer drivers. Those are options as well. But the reality is, for many non-drivers, we are relying on our friends and family for rides. But this comes with real costs, both emotional costs and also, if you don't have that network or you feel like you've tapped out that network, people often do get stuck at home. This is an image of Jaime Torres, who says, "It is beyond frustrating to have to depend on others for transportation. It really affects me to the point where it's easier to just isolate myself in my room so I don't feel like a burden." Amanda Sutherland, who's a low vision non-driver, said, "Whenever I call or text somebody asking for a ride, I start to wonder, are they going to get back to me or not? Should I call a second person? There are times I would rather walk even several miles than deal with the anxiety of finding a ride." Uh, so yeah, if you are relying on others, it can be nice. You can have that network, you can have those relationships. But many people that I've talked to, and myself included, really prefer the independence and the freedom of having a transportation system that allows us to go where we need to go when we need to go without that negotiation of favors. And that kind of transportation system needs to have reliable transit. It also needs to have sidewalks and pedestrian access, right? So we can get to transit safely and comfortably. And this is especially true for disabled community members who may, absolutely require an accessible sidewalk, right? If there's no sidewalk, then people are having to roll in the street with a truck. There's an image here of Tanisha who rolling next to a semi where the sidewalk is broken. We need safe crossings. There's an image here of Micah, who's a blind white cane user trying to cross an unsignalized highway on-ramp. And there's an image of that on-ramp in the next image of folks walking in front of and trying to block traffic to allow other people to cross. We also need our sidewalks to be clear and not cracked or bumped with big uplifts that are tripping hazards that can flip or tip over wheelchairs, that are free from snow or ice. And debris like blackberry bushes or leaves. These can all be dangerous, uncomfortable, and really limit people's mobility. Crystal Monteros, who's a wheelchair user that I interviewed in my book, said, "We need to start thinking of public transportation and sidewalks as going together instead of two separate things. You can't use the bus if you can't get yourself to the bus stop." And so, really thinking of it as a network, right, rather than separate systems is so critical. My computer is, yes, there we go. And another piece of this is construction access. This is an image of a walk roll audit in Seattle that is trying to cross a busy arterial and getting blocked as folks in a wheelchair try to roll up onto a sidewalk. There's a sidewalk closed sign blocking the sidewalk. And so, this applies to construction detours as well. Having lived in New York City for a while, I know people complain about the scaffolding, but for me, it's really lovely that there is scaffolding and often sidewalks that are, remain, that access continues. Where in Seattle, construction just shuts down the sidewalk. And so you have to cross whether or not there's a safe place to cross there. So thinking about construction access as well. Another piece of access, potential access is the new, the expansion of micro-mobility options. For many people with disabilities who can't drive, biking, triking, using a power wheelchair, these are really good options to cover larger distances, especially in communities that are more spread out, like many of our communities are across the US. There's an image here of Cody Shane, who lives in a rural community in Washington State using a trike to get around. An image on the far right of Ivy Take, who's in Tucson, Arizona. She, like me, has nystagmus and uses an e-bike to get around. Though before e-bikes sort of came onto the scene, she used a golf cart for many years to transport her family. And then this image in the middle is of Ian Mackey, who's a power wheelchair user. And I think we've seen this incredible expansion of the mobility options for better e-trikes, e-bikes, lighter batteries, longer lasting batteries. But those same changes haven't come as quickly to the power wheelchair industry. A lot of times because those that are covered by insurance, and there's just not the same incentives for innovation. And so Ian Mackey's someone who's really pushing power wheelchair companies to innovate and to create more durable, longer lasting, waterproof wheelchairs. He says, oftentimes people's lifestyles are shaped by the equipment that they have. People could do so much more, and the equipment is determining the direction of their life. A family should be able to go spend the day at Disneyland and not run out of batteries. So that's a hopeful thing that, we can, I think, push for, and also push for the infrastructure that we need to be able to use these smaller electric vehicles safely and comfortably in our communities. But at the end of the day, we need to be thinking about our land use and zoning and housing, right? Because if we have communities that are super sprawling, and where the distances you need to travel or where you can afford to live is really far from where you need to get groceries, where you work, where your school is, where your medical appointments are, it's much harder if you can't drive, if you're a non-driver, to make that work. And the housing affordability crisis really is driving people out further and further from where there is reliable transit and where there are connected sidewalk networks. There's a quote here from Vaughn Brown, who's a low vision and hard of hearing individual in Washington State. And he says, more affordability means moving further out. Moving further out means more limited transportation. And I think that really is the crux of so much of our country, where we have the most affordable housing gets built on the outskirts. And then people who can't afford cars are, stuck far away from where they need to go. This image on the top is a community in Washington State that's a low-income community that has transit, but doesn't have a great sidewalk network. And this is a bus stop where, to get to that bus stop, if you were a wheelchair user, and even as a pedestrian who can walk, it would be really challenging or completely impossible. And there's loose gravel and this big curb, and then a bunch of lanes of fast moving traffic. I often hear, okay, well, so we don't actually need to invest in transit though, or sidewalks, because autonomous vehicles are going to take us all where we need to go very soon. And that solution, I think, is a false promise. It's a promise that for many years we've been hearing, and I think it's distracted us from investing in the sorts of things that we could do right now to make our communities more accessible by thinking about land use and housing and transit and sidewalks. Ride hail is expensive, increasingly expensive, especially because many people who are non-drivers are low income. It's just not attainable, and it's also not wheelchair accessible in most parts of our country. Amandeep Kaur here, who's pictured in the middle, she's a white cane user, says, in the blind community, not all blind people have good jobs. Students and others are struggling financially, and Uber is expensive. These technologies will continue to be expensive. They don't scale the way that other kinds of transit scales. And there's also challenges with even with micro transit, where you're having, subsidized on-demand transit, giving people rides for parents. And we have it here in Seattle. I have a young kid, he needs a car seat. I can't really use the service because I have to put him in these vehicles without a car seat. I'm not able to schlep around a car seat all day with me as I run errands. And so there's limitations, and they're also just perhaps, the people designing these systems aren't really thinking about the people who have the least mobility access and what we need, and the kinds of systems that would work for us and be affordable and accessible for us. So how do we get the people who are designing our transportation systems, who are making these decisions, making investments, to think about what we need as non-drivers, and especially as disabled non-drivers, as low-income non-drivers? How can we change that frame to help them realize that? The last chapter of my book really talks about what it would take to change who's in the room, who's making decisions. And one suggestion I have is the Week Without Driving Challenge, which is a challenge that we launched at Disability Rights Washington in 2021, and now is a national challenge that has been that America Walks helps us organize nationally. And there's a quote here from Ivanova Smith, who says, legislators don't understand the pain and agony of standing in the rain at a bus stop or having to be stuck at a crosswalk and missing your bus. Can you imagine waiting in the rain another hour, waiting for the next bus? I don't think a lot of people, who are in power, in decision-making roles understand that. And this image of the top shows some folks who are waiting in the rain at a bus stop without a shelter for a bus. So we created the Week Without Driving Challenge to really address this question. The way the challenge works is that folks take the challenge and they try not to drive themselves for 1 week. They can ask for rides, they could pay for rides if that's within their budget. They can walk, they can roll, they can bike, they can take transit, whatever is available to them, available in their communities. And it counts for all their trips, not just their work trips. Because I think, if you rely on transit, it could be relatively easy to go places if you're using a transit system that's designed for work trip commutes. But if you're trying to go somewhere on the weekend or at night, that can be much trickier. And then we asked people to really reflect on how easy or how impossible it was for them to participate. Because if you can afford to live in an area that's well served by transit, that has good sidewalks or bike infrastructure, it could be relatively easy for you to do this. But if those things aren't the case, then it's really different. And we also recognize that, for some people, driving is their job. So, that doesn't count. Or, that there may be particular trips that they just can't make work. Perhaps, they need to take a loved one to a medical appointment or a kid to a sports game. But when they're choosing to drive, we ask them to really think about, okay, for someone who didn't have that choice, who was in your position, what would they do? Would they forego that medical appointment? Would their kid not to get to participate in that activity? So I'm going to play a little video from some highlights from, and this is a very short video, from last year from the Week Without Driving, from some of the communities that participated. I think we had organizations in 41 different states take the challenge, and this year we're hoping for all 50. But here's a few highlights from last year.
A new challenge is shining a light on how difficult life can be without access to a car. Today is the first day of the Week Without Driving Challenge.
And the goal is to have all of us and our local leaders develop a better understanding of life for those who don't own a vehicle. A Week Without Driving continues today in La Crosse with more free rides.
This week, the city of La Crosse is celebrating Week Without Driving with a special bingo game and by also offering free rides. Starting today, it's the nationwide Week Without Driving. And King County is hosting this challenge with more than 123 communities and cities.
Council member Claudia Balducci says across the board, about 30% of people don't have a car. That's why she and the council proclaimed the next 7 days as the Week Without Driving.
In Humboldt County, it almost feels impossible to get from point A to point B without a car. But those with disabilities and those who cannot afford to drive face that challenge every day. Council member Renee Contreras de Loche spoke from her own personal experience of using transit in the past.
Challenging, trying to figure out how we were going to get to music equipment, to school, to doctor's appointments.
The challenge isn't about not using a car. It's more about seeing what it's like not being able to have access to a car.
A quarter of Rochester households don't have access to a personal vehicle. So for a lot of Rochester households, this isn't really a choice.
I'm standing at a bus stop in Seattle's Soto neighborhood that doesn't have a shelter over. That's just one barrier Disability Rights Washington wants the public and policymakers to become more aware of during its Week Without Driving challenge.
This week is a full circle moment for Durham Mayor Pro Tem Mark Anthony Middleton, who's taking the bus to and from City Hall, utilizing ride shares and walking to get around.
Any city that's going to consider itself great, a great metropolis, has to cross the threshold where the city is negotiable without a car.
All right. Oh, now it's replaying. Let's see. Next slide. All right. So yeah, that gives you a sense of sort of the scale of this challenge and the places and communities that really took it on and learned. In Washington State, since we've been doing it for a couple of years now, since 2021, we've really seen it start to shift the conversation with elected leaders. There's a slide here from a council member who was pointing out how little lighting there was at bus stops, and what that made her understand about our need to fund transit and fund transit infrastructure. Another big realization I think that's come out of this from elected leaders is how difficult it would be to run for office and be considered a competent and successful elected leader if you couldn't drive, because the requirements of being an elected leader mean you have to get around and go to a lot of events very quickly. And there's a quote here from Councilmember Neil Black, who says, let's see, it's kind of hard to imagine how someone who didn't have access to a car could do the job of a city council member. Our expectations are to be in a lot of different places at a lot of different times. In a suburban city like ours, it's a challenge to do that without driving. And that means there's a large segment of the population excluded from serving in this role. And so what we see is that, a lot of the times elected leaders aren't themselves transit riders. And as you know, our transit agencies, the boards of these transit agencies they consist of elected leaders representing different jurisdictions. So what happens is we have transit boards that don't actually reflect the needs or the desires or even an awareness of what transit riders need. There's an image here on the right of in Washington State, we were really struggling with a transit agency board that was trying to cut sales taxes, and therefore that would reduce transit service. And the board members on that board, none of them were regular transit riders. And so it wasn't impacting them. It was, but it was a decision they were choosing to make. We have another quote here from Lindsay Schwarman Warren, who's a city council member from Port Angeles, Washington, who, as a result of the Week Without Driving Challenge, really started reflecting on what it meant that we didn't have transit riders on transit boards. And he says, most of our board members are not frequent transit riders. We recognize the direct stake that riders have in public transit. This is a simple policy that ensures nothing about us without us. And what he's talking about is a proposed law that we worked on trying to pass last year in the state legislature to require transit boards to hold 2 voting seats for transit riders, so that we'd actually have some people in the room who ride transit. And I know this has been a conversation in other cities as well. There's a tweet here about the MARTA board in Atlanta. And how many members there were issued transit cards and how many trips they took in the previous year. Someone put in a public records request and got that information. And it shows that some of the transit board members hardly rode transit at all. And that really is not uncommon. We've seen, transit boards without transit riders just not have a deep enough understanding of the needs of transit riders. There's an image here of Chris Colcock, who's a blind transit rider, and she said, it is suggested that that the commissioners of Kitsap Transit take a day and just use the bus system. The immediate response is, well, we don't have time to do that. And we hear that a lot, right? I'm too busy to take transit. I'm an important person. I shouldn't have to take transit. And yet these are the people often, managing our systems. Judy Jones, who's another transit rider, said, because many on transit boards tend to be car drivers, they really haven't internalized what it means to be a transit rider. Those decisions determine whether you are a transit rider. You as a transit rider are going to be able to keep a job, going to be able to continue to be a caregiver, going to be able to continue to go to school. So we did work on this legislation in Washington State, and we are inspired by some transit boards that do have seats for transit riders. Intercity Transit in Washington State, which is in Thurston County, Washington, they have a transit board, and they actually have two seats for transit riders. Their chair of their transit board is actually a community representative. So we know it can work. So we worked on legislation last year. There's an image here of Councilmember Lindsay Schwarman Warren testifying in support of this legislation, as well as the bill text. Unfortunately, the bill did not pass last year. It got held up at the end. There was opposition, I think, from transit agencies themselves, which was unfortunate. Because at the end of the day, our interests as transit riders should be aligned with transit agencies. But change is difficult, and I think they felt that perhaps transit riders wouldn't have the expertise and the knowledge to be helpful and members of these boards. But from our perspective, there's a lot of sort of ableism and I guess paternalism towards transit riders, even within transit agencies. And so by insisting that transit riders really do have expertise and really do have knowledge of the system because they're using it day in and day out, we can counter some of that paternalism. So at the end of the day, we are hoping, right, both for transit agencies that work better for transit riders, for transit that works better for transit riders, and for communities that work better for non-drivers. There's a quote here from Tamara Jackson, who's with the Wisconsin Non-Driver Advisory Board. She's also on the Wisconsin Board of People with Developmental Disabilities. And she said, no one can get away from that number, 31% of the population being non-drivers. It's a shocking number for us in Wisconsin. And I think it really is, a shocking number for everyone, right? That there's such a large percentage of the population across the country, not just in big cities like New York, but also in rural states as well, like Wisconsin and states like Washington. There's a big percentage of the people who can't drive and can't afford to drive, and also people who choose not to drive. And all together, we do have political power and we can reshape our communities. There's an image here on the left of a group of us in Seattle working on legislation to get funding for sidewalks, to get built missing sidewalks. And we did that in partnership with groups that work for active transportation users, with transit groups, with groups that care about the environment, with labor groups, right? If we can build these coalitions, that's what it's going to take to change the narrative. Because right now there's this narrative that, drivers are important, our economy relies on drivers, there aren't that many people who aren't drivers. And the reality is that's just not true. We have built a system over the last 100 years that has really prioritized drivers, that has prioritized the easy movement of cars. These are some images of the highway in Indiana, I-64, being built through my family's farm back in the 60s. And that ease of access, that ease of getting on the highway and going quickly, those are all choices that we made as a community to really invest in this massive infrastructure system built around cars. But we can undo those choices. We can build communities that work better for everyone, that work better for people who can't drive. And so that's my hope in the next 100 years, that we can move away from car dependency by really centering the needs of non-drivers and figuring out ways for us to build communities that make it possible for us to be fully included, whether or not we can drive. So I'm going to open it up for questions now. There's a code here for my book. You can also get it from the New York Transit Museum, and my email is up there as well, as it's annazivarts@gmail.com. You can follow me on social media. I would say LinkedIn is probably the best place right now. Also experimenting a bit with TikTok, at Week Without Driving on TikTok. And I will put it on this last slide here and open it up to questions.
Okay, amazing, Anna. Thank you so much for sharing this. I feel like the non-driving driving framework is such a useful way to think about some of these issues, and it's not a way that we are commonly used to probably framing them. So I think that's a really helpful one. So yes, please add any questions to the chat. Love to hear your thoughts. In the meantime, I was just thinking up some questions as you were talking. Do you feel that there's any particular place or maybe city or state that seems a little bit, they're doing positive developments or kind of making a lot of strides forward in this regard? Any places that are kind of leading the path?
Yeah, no, I feel like there's really good things happening in a lot of communities. I'm excited, by this Wisconsin Non-Driver Advisory Committee. I think Wisconsin's doing some interesting work to think about non-drivers. They have done research to show where non-drivers live throughout their state. And you can look at that. They have a map online, and they're adding layers now around transit access for non-drivers and pedestrian access. So you can see, where the gaps exist. And they've also, I think that data is really interesting because it shows that, it's not just big cities, that some of their rural counties and rural communities have really high percentages of non-drivers because of a lot of seniors and a lot of poverty. And that I think helps, make sure that those communities get transit funding, get access to resources for non-drivers. So that's one place. I mentioned intercity transit in Thurston County for having a transit system that does bring the voices of transit riders onto the transit board. I think that's exciting. And then, I think for communities that are thinking about, access, and I guess, we think about big cities as being accessible for non-drivers, which is true because of this, that density and the ability to, have transit and transit that scales. Like those things are really great. I think we can also do it in some of our more rural areas. And so I'm excited by places that have multi-use trails that make it possible for people to get places, without being on the shoulder of a highway. In Washington State, we're building what we call the Heritage Trail Network on the Yakama Nation to make sure that people aren't, exposed to crash danger by being on the edge of a shoulder trying to walk places. So I think those things are all important. And I know that there's so many efforts and so many, people fighting for good transit, fighting for sidewalks, fighting for safe and comfortable and inclusive bike infrastructure in communities all over. And it really does take that local advocacy.
Yeah, I can imagine that, you mentioned all these interlocking issues and that are so connected to the core problems, whether it's housing and affordability and land use and development. So it seems like there's a lot of moving pieces. And I guess legislation is one way to kind of bring those kind of diverse entities together. Is there particular kind of areas or communities or kind of stakeholders that are more amenable to kind of getting more involved in these issues and being more accessible, or what are the big barriers?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, one thing I realized as I started to do organizing work in Washington State was how excited people were who were not sort of the typical, like bike advocate, urbanist, folks who are choosing not to drive, more or less. How many folks who didn't have the choice, who were non-drivers, involuntary non-drivers, how excited those folks were to be engaged and be doing advocacy, and perhaps hadn't had a space to do that advocacy in before because they hadn't really felt like they were part of, or seen by, or their needs were taken into consideration by typical like bike ped or urbanist groups. And so I do think there's a lot of potential for coalition building for groups that haven't really had a lot of connections to the disability community, to build those connections and bring those perspectives into your work, whether that's, bike ped work or transit advocacy or housing advocacy, zoning advocacy, parking reform advocacy, right? Like I think all those spaces, there's room to build bigger tents and really think about, people who perhaps have less choices, and the kinds of choices people have in the advocacy and in the solutions that you're pushing for.
That makes sense. We have a question in the chat here. Do you have experience using microtransit, paratransit in any cities in Washington or other states? New York City has paratransit, but it's also provides a lot of logistical hassles, I guess, for people with disabilities who need to use those services.
Yeah, paratransit is an important piece of access for many people, right? And I think there's lots of reasons for that. Sometimes it's because, someone might prefer to use a fixed route bus, but there's no sidewalk or there's no accessible sidewalk or there's no safe crossing. And so their only option is to get picked up, from their house. And with paratransit, you have to pre-schedule in most places a day or so in advance. There's a pickup window that, they could be late. You end up taking pretty circuitous routes. It takes much longer than even the bus, right? Like, so there's So that's all difficult, but you know, for some people that's what they need to use. And for other people, you know, you need that kind of like walking even a short distance or rolling a short distance, even if there is a sidewalk, just isn't accessible. And so, you know, paratransit really can provide that service. And in some places, right, like there are no, if you can't afford a wheelchair accessible car or van and someone to drive you, you know, paratransit might be your only option, because, you know, there is no sidewalk, there is no accessible taxi company in most places in this country. And so, really critical. At the same time, it can be really difficult to have a job if you know, you're relying on paratransit and the pickups take so long and their delays can be so significant. We're actually, you know, toying with the idea of legislation here in Washington State to try to make it paratransit more reliable so that people can more reliably have jobs and be less late. So those are all tricky things. I know, you know, there's been a push to have, you know, some paratransit trips be replaced by Uber and Lyft or other ride hail. And for people who don't need wheelchair accessible vehicles, perhaps that could work. But I have a lot of concerns about, you know, privatizing parts of our system and, you know, peeling off the folks who are easier to serve. And then, you know, what happens to the folks then who can't use Uber and Lyft? What happens to their service? Does it improve or does it get worse? And, you know, if you're relying then on a private company to provide a service, if that private company, you know, goes away suddenly, then what happens? And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of pieces there. And ultimately, I mean, big picture, right? Like we need communities that are less car dependent. We need the things that we need to get to closer to where we live. But you know, there are always going to be some folks who are going to need that, you know, that door-to-door service, and we should have systems set up to make that possible.
Yeah. Do you see the biggest barrier is just kind of the cost of putting some of these programs and making these changes? There was actually a comment in the chat about getting sidewalks installed in Pennsylvania, saying the customary funding mechanism is to bill the adjacent property owner, who then has to be responsible for snow removal and trash removal. And this is a disincentive because then people are complaining about the cost. And that the city ended up siding with homeowners because, you know, people just don't want to pay.
People don't want to pay, right? And when we privatize that, you know, people are like, oh, I can't, right? And it's frustrating because you think about, okay, if we ask people to pay for and repair and maintain the piece of like road in front of their house, then people wouldn't do that either. And it's frustrating that we have sidewalks be this sort of, you know, private responsibility rather than a societal or social responsibility, right? And so it would be great if it was, you know, on the local jurisdiction to build and maintain sidewalks the way we have them responsible for building and maintaining roads. You know, but that costs money, right? And local jurisdictions don't want to do it if it costs money. And so, and we see already, you know, like communities where, you know, the state will, you know, offer to build a sidewalk along a piece of highway, but the local community, you know, that it goes through has to maintain it. The local community will say, no, right? We don't want this sidewalk, because we don't want to take on the additional maintenance costs. So, yeah, I mean, there's a whole backlog of maintenance, infrastructure maintenance in our country for roads as well. But really, you know, we need to figure out how do we maintain both our roads and build out and maintain a complete sidewalk network, and leaving it up to individual property owners is, you know, not really an equitable solution.
Yeah, definitely makes sense. It seems like, you know, plans that you're doing, like the Week Without Driving campaigns, are really important in helping to raise awareness and kind of shift the sensibilities and the priorities. When is your next campaign going to be launching? I don't know if you'd already mentioned the date.
Sorry, say that one more time.
For 2024, have you already launched your Week Without Driving?
Yes. Oh, yes. Week Without Driving is September 30th through October 6th this year. So yeah, we're getting ready for it. You can go to weekwithoutdriving.org and check that out. Yeah, we have a terrific organizer with America Rocks, Ruth Rosas, who can get you all the information you need if you can't find something on the website, but there's lots of toolkits there, templates, lists of other organizations that are already signed up. So if you're in a particular state and you want to see who else from your state or your community is participating, you can go and check that out. And yeah, and sign up and encourage and nudge elected leaders in your community to sign up as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. We're hopefully to see more of that campaign and can get involved. And we'll share more of that information as we know about it as well. Thank you so much, Anna, for sharing your book and your perspective and really helping to kind of raise a lot of these really critical issues and show how they're so connected and so important to really make, transportation work for everybody. And thank you all for joining us and joining our programming. Again, we invite you to join us at the museum. We're open Thursday through Sunday, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. You can reserve tickets on our website. Also, if you enjoyed this program, please consider making a donation or becoming a member. Those that help and support always helps keep our programs going. We also hope you join us for more upcoming virtual events, which you can find on our website. I can put some link in the chat here. Our next virtual program is coming up next Friday, July 25th at 2 p.m. Last stop, Coney Island. We'll have our digital archivists share recent additions to our digital photo collection, all featuring various historical photos of Coney Island. And we're also going to have a tour of the Coney Island Museum with the program director, Adam Ring, which should be a lot of fun. Our Nostalgia Ride to Coney Island is unfortunately sold out, but there are still a few tickets available to our ride to the Rockaways on August 11th. And all stations visited are accessible, as are all the trains, so we hope folks can join us. So thanks again for being part of our program. Thank you again, Anna Zivarts, for sharing your book. Please get it. I put the link in the chat. It's a great one to really learn more about these issues. Thanks to our ASL interpreters. I hope everyone has a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.